What's good, y'all? It's your boy Mixtape Moth. If you are rocking with this content, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But today, I'm going to hit y'all with a topic that I have been contemplating really for a long time, but I haven't gotten the opportunity to address it until now, and that is the topic of regional biases in hip-hop. And I want to focus on whether there has been an East Coast bias against the South and West Coast hip-hop. Now, we know there's some regional biases always going to exist because as people, we tend to want to embrace the artists who are coming from our own specific regions. There have always been distinct regional sounds in hip-hop, so it's kind of expected. But the older I get and the more I attempt to be a hip-hop historian, the more I find myself wanting to break free from those regional biases, and the more I find myself appreciating the different regional sounds and styles that exist. So the main question was, has there been an East Coast bias in hip-hop against the South? And the answer to that, absolutely, especially in the 1990s. And I want to be clear that this is not an anti-New York hip-hop video. I'm just calling it like I saw it, as I am a little older and I remember how things went in the 90s. So New York being the birthplace, the epicenter, and the mecca of hip-hop, it stands to reason that on the East Coast, folks would consider New York to be the standard bearer for lyricism, style, and all the other elements of hip-hop. I'm sure we have heard this narrative before, and there's a little bit of truth to it. New York artists tended to be a little more lyrical. You could argue that they had more complex rhyme schemes, more intricate wordplay, and possibly an overall sharper skill set. But you can never sleep on what some of the ill Southern and West Coast MCs were doing also at this time. Now, in interviews and on wax, Southern rap pioneers like Willie D and Scarface talked about how Southern rappers just didn't get the respect from New York in the late 80s and into the 90s. But for some perspective, I have to say there were no major labels out of the South during this time. There was Rap-A-Lot, Suave House, No Limit, but they were still independent. Memphis goats like 8-Ball and MJG talked about not getting their props either. And the late great Pimp C talked about how New York was hating on the South and they just couldn't respect their country rap tune. And here's the big one. In 1995 at the Source Awards, Andre 3000 famously said, "The South's got something to say." The South's got something to say. So those were iconic and powerful words that shed some light into, the mindset that Southern rappers felt at this time. So I want to talk about some of the reasons why the South, and later I'll get into the West Coast a little bit, but why the South didn't get as much love from New York. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is New York always had a larger media presence than any place in the South, whether we're talking about major record labels or the big hip hop publications at the time. They were mostly based out the East Coast, and I'm talking about The Source, Rap Pages, etc. I believe the only magazine that focused more so on the South, the Midwest, and the West Coast was Murder Dog, if y'all remember Murder Dog. And in the Source magazine, which was considered at one point the Bible for hip-hop heads, you could see evidence of this bias against Southern artists when they would get their albums reviewed. Now, I'm not saying that all Southern artists got low mic ratings, because that wouldn't be true, but they did tend to receive lower mic ratings than New York artists, for sure. Case in point, Hypnotized Minds artists and No Limit artists. So albums from 3 6 Mafia, Project Pat, Gangsta Boo, La Chat, all got what you could say is slighted, which is kind of crazy considering the impact that those 90s and 2000s, Memphis albums had much of the sounds today. I also think some of the East Coast bias had something to do with the stigma that was attached to the way Southern rappers talked and rapped. Their slang was different. The way they rapped tended to be slower, real talk, and the way they enunciated words was a lot different from New York artists. Therefore, some East Coast heads, and I'm not talking about all of them, some may have dismissed Southern rap as just being slow in general due to their dialect. Even if a Southern artist had bars, some New York heads might not have liked it because of their Southern accents. Some purists might not have deemed them as super lyrical because of this. So that brings me into the differences in production sounds. On the East Coast, you had more sample-based production, more of a jazz influence, more gritty, soulful, boom bap, just a lot of samples in general. Whereas down south, there was more of an emphasis on live instrumentation, 808s, slower rolling bass lines, and just different drum pattern. So in fairness, I could see how this might sound out of whack to someone who was used to listening to the production sounds found on albums from Black Moon, DITC artists, Gangstar, A Tribe Called Quest. I mean, you had to have a trained ear for Southern hip hop. I also want to talk about the role of mixtapes and how mixtapes tended to favor East Coast artists at the time. Because let's face it, New York mixtape DJs had a bigger distribution than places in the South, in the Midwest. Don't get me wrong, there was a mixtape scene down south in places like Memphis and Houston, DJ Screw, especially in Houston. But those mixtapes didn't receive a lot of push outside of the South, whereas New York mixtape DJs had a larger reach. And guess what? They mostly played artists from the East Coast, which is a no-brainer. I mean, think of the DJ Clue mixtapes, the Funk Flex tapes, Ron G, Tony Touches, and Doo-Wops. These were predominantly East Coast MCs being played. Now, shifting gears for a moment, when talking about the New York bias against the West Coast, I'm going to the West. There was somewhat of a bias that did exist in the 90s, but I don't think it was nearly as strong as the one against the South. Sure, the East Coast, West Coast war made folks choose a side and divided things further, but the LA hip-hop scene was pretty prominent during the early to mid-90s, whether we were talking about the NWA years, and the ones leading up to Death Row's dominance from like 1992 to 95. With landmark albums like The Chronic and Doggy Style. Heck, even Biggie admitted that the West Coast influenced some of Ready to Die. So while New York was still very much the mecca at this time, the West Coast did get a lot of love on the East Coast during this G-Funk time period. Now, the Bay Area, on the other hand, I felt they stayed more regional, as they always have, getting it out the trunks of their car, staying independent during this time in the 90s. So as a result, I would say that Los Angeles artists tended to get a little more play than the Bay Area outside of California. And I also know there were East Coast boom bap aficionados who would listen to more Los Angeles or West Coast based artists than they would Southern rappers. You could be the biggest East Coast fanatic and be Timberland down, Fatigue down, like you were DOS Effects on the cover of Hold It Down. Just picture that image. And there would be a good chance that you might also listen to the Alcoholics, Razcast, The Far Side, Souls of Mischief, Corrupt, Lady of Rage, the DOC, Snoop, Pac, and Q. Especially the West Coast artists who had more of a East Coast sound sonically, like the Alcoholics, the Far Side, and Souls of Mischief. They were getting heavy play from East Coast heads. So I say that to say this. While New York rap remained on top in the 90s, the West Coast wasn't too far behind them as far as getting their props. A bias still existed, but not as prevalent as the one against the South. Now, when we fast forward to today, things are way different. There's obviously less of a bias as a lot of regional hip hop has been compromised, as the traditional New York sound isn't what it once was, despite the successful attempts at Griselda and other upstate New York heads who have really revitalized and brought back traditional hip hop in a big way. Despite New York Underground holding it down for that more traditional sound, a lot of New York artists have taken their cue from the Chicago drill scene. So we get a lot of drill rappers in New York, and others have even adopted more of the melodic trap route found in Atlanta. I still think a little bit of a bias exists against the South and West today, mainly when people tend to give their top 5 or top 10 rappers of all time lists. We tend to see more New York MCs populate those lists than Southern and West Coast MCs. I'd say with the exception of like Lil Wayne, Scarface, Andre 3000, and on the West, Kendrick and Pac, most of the lists contain New York MCs, which is fine. I don't have an issue with it. People are gonna like what they like, and there are incredible East Coast MCs. There's no denying that. But I'm just pointing out that it's not as common to see the following artists on these lists: Bun B, A-Bone MJG, K Reno, Devin the Dude, Big Crit, T.I., Luda, Playa Fly, Big Mike, David Banner, or Lord Infamous. That being said, I cannot let the South off the hook entirely, as there are some Southern rap fans who have a bias against the East Coast or traditional boom bap hip hop as well, which can be just as annoying. However, I find that it typically comes from younger fans who may associate boom bap with something old. But to keep it a buck, I know some older heads from the South who will tell you that they don't listen to Nas, they don't listen to Mobb Deep, they don't listen to Biggie, and they don't listen to Jay-Z. And I'm not just talking about Big Gip. Now, truth be told, part of the reason that I felt comfortable calling some New Yorkers out on their bias is because I once had an East Coast bias, a little bit of one, in the 90s. This was when I held the Source magazine in higher regard until, they lost their credibility with their mic ratings. Thanks a lot, Benzino. Even with my preference early on for East Coast hip hop at a young age, I was such a hip hop junkie that I bought music from all coasts, all regions, didn't matter whether it was the Midwest, Dirty South, East Coast, the West. And as I got older and the more I traveled, I got put onto Southern artists and West Coast and Midwest rappers that I didn't listen to quite as much in the 90s. And I'm grateful that I was open to exploring more and not being closed off. And at the end of the day, I understand that everything isn't going to be for everyone and people are going to like what you like. But I do feel at the same time it's very important, if you call yourself a real hip hop head, that you should be aiming to listen to more than just one particular style or era of hip hop. I mean, that's just how I see it, because ultimately you will be missing out on a good deal of hip hop. Let me know in the comment section what your thoughts are on this bias. But it's your boy Mixtape Moth. I'm signing out. Be sure to hit that like button and please subscribe to their channel. As always, it's peace and blessings, regional biases in hip hop.